Um, I don't know if everybody remembers Hurricane Katrina. I mean, everybody remembers it, but you remember the days leading up to it. And the watching the news as, you know, we're watching the Doppler radar and the mass they show as it's churning in the Gulf and it's leading towards landfall. And at that time, when it was still in the Gulf, I believe it was listed as a Category 5 hurricane, and we had heard all the reports about masses of people being left in New Orleans and having no place to go. And in capitalist society, the state is not organized to remove people and provide them shelter at any time, especially during times of, you know, natural occurrence as devastating as this one was looking to be. When it touched landfall, I think it was it was a Category 1, maybe a Category 2. It was much weaker than they anticipated, and most of the devastation was caused when the levees broke, and the fact that people were left without any resources, you know, in the sweltering heat to live with subhuman conditions and no food, no shelter, and having to take care of themselves and rescue their neighbors and themselves. But if you can recall watching it, I know for the 24 hours or so leading up to it, I didn't sleep. I was watching the news. I think many people are watching the news. You're watching CNN and MSNBC, and you want to see events unfold because you're hoping that it's not as devastating as it appears, and you're hoping that people are spared, you know, the brunt of the storm, and that everything's going to work out okay. And obviously, that's not what happened. But you know, the body functions without us being cognizant of its functions. We don't tell our heart to beat. We don't tell ourselves to breathe. We're not conscious of the oxygenation of our blood or any of the processes that are happening right now as we sit in this meeting. But during that particular time, I remember just holding my breath and saying, okay, take a second to breathe. Take a breath. And when the news first came in that there had been a mass shooting in South Carolina, they didn't immediately release the amount of people that were killed. It was just that there had been a shooting in a church. It was about 9 or 8 o'clock that evening. I don't know how many people were aware of it at that time. It was actually around 10 when I had saw it, and I think it was on Facebook. And then I went to CNN. There wasn't that much information. And this was one of those times. It's very similar. You're saying, well, I hope that no one is dead. And we didn't know who was responsible, what the circumstances were. You just hope everything goes normal during the day, relatively normal for most of us, and we go about our day and go to work, take care of our family, we eat dinner, and there are all kind of atrocities that happen all over the world, some that we never find out until years later. But this particular thing was a time when I'm sure many of us, myself included, had to say, take a moment to breathe. And so that morning, so usually in our house, the TV's not on during the day except for Sesame Street. Sheila gets an hour of Sesame Street a day, and she gets mad when we turn it off, but that's really that's too much. But she likes Elmo. She likes to sing the Elmo song. She even says Sesame. If you know her speak, she sang Sesame. But Thursday was not one of those days. Thursday, throughout the entire day, we watched the news, Ciola and I. And it's hard. She didn't understand what's actually happening. But you sometimes think, well, maybe they are absorbing some of this in some way, and it will have an effect on them, but wanting to learn more information about it. And so the news ran. In the background, And we listened to it and watched the images. And I switched back and forth to the different stations, even to Fox News, just to sort of, for shits and giggles, you kind of knowing what they're going to say, and listening and watching her and sighing and getting angry and upset and wanting to yell, but the one thing she does understand is elevated voice, even though she yells at me all the time, and telling myself to breathe. Every day in the U.S. reminds us of the phenomena of white supremacy and national oppression. But it is these extraordinary events like Hurricane Katrina and Charleston that really expose it for all of its brutality, its nakedness, and the fact that this country is a country that is made of many different nations, the most oppressed of which are besieged on all sides. And if you are a black person, you feel it. You don't feel it like the family members who feel it personally, but you feel it. And you imagine what it must be like. Most of us here have suffered loss, but you imagine what it must be like to anticipate someone coming home and walking through the door. Or maybe we all have our rituals, of how often we speak to our families. Some we sort of grit our teeth and we call our families that we love but we don't necessarily like, maybe once a week, because we have a love for them, even though they sometimes get on our nerves. But we look forward to it because we want to know what's going on in their lives. But you can imagine someone expecting that. A kid, a partner, a grandchild, an aunt, an uncle, a parent. One of the youngest persons, I believe, was 22, 26, Taiwanza, had just finished college, was a barber. And I'm sure someone was expecting to get his call. So you sympathize with the people who lost their beloved ones. But if you were black, whether you knew them or not, you feel it. You live it every day and you breathe it in. And if you are an oppressed person, you empathize with it. A Palestinian person can understand having suffered massacres at the hand of the Zionists. An indigenous person, a Latino person, oppressed people around the world can understand the feelings that someone would have at a time such as this. And if you are a person of conscience, you understand and you feel saddened and you feel angry. Watching the news and listening to the pundits and listening to all the so-called officials, the cops, the former cops, the special agents, all of the people who deem themselves experts into the human psychology, into why someone would do this, and you listen to all of the explanations as to what this is, and you hear someone like Rick Santorum who says it's because of religion, the same anti-Islamic Rick Santorum who wants the U.S. to deem all Muslim people as potential terrorists and to profile them, talks about freedom of religion and this being an attack against religion. Giuliani, same thing. His actual quote is, "We have no idea what's in his mind. Maybe he hates Christian churches." It wasn't a white church that Dylan Roth went into. He didn't pick a random church just to walk into and to start shooting people. And I looked on his Facebook page. I'm sure a lot of people did. That's the first thing you do. Even that Rachel Dolezal person, I went and looked on her Facebook page. It's not even worth discussing, right? But when you hear these sort of things, you want to go and see what kind of profile this person has. And his profile picture was of him, of the apartheid flag of South Africa and the Rhodesian flag when the white rule was in Zimbabwe. And there was a picture of him sitting on the hood of his car with vanity plates of the Confederate flag. It's not difficult to understand what his motivations were. It's only for people who want to sort of sweep under the rug the whole history of racist oppression. They don't want to make this a thing, especially now, and they don't want it to be linked to the struggle against police brutality and the struggle against black oppression in general. The one thing that I would say that is different within this case, and we owe that to the black struggle, is that MSNBC and CNN and even Fox, even Geraldo Rivera, have been forced because of the struggle to use the word terrorism. And that is because there are many people who've been drawing attention to the fact that there have been designations used for oppressed people because of certain events that don't get used for white people. When I don't watch hockey. Is Blackhawks, Black Wings, whatever, when they won the Stanley Cup, which happens fairly frequently on a college campus, or when the hockey team wins, because black people, we don't really watch hockey. Some people do. There was a couple of black hockey players that actually had to deal with racial slurs. But that's not a sport that we necessarily partake in, for whatever reason. We don't generally watch it. After the Chicago Blackhawks, which is a name of indigenous people that was used just like they use indigenous names as mascots and emblems as mascots on sports teams regularly. And they don't see that as racist. How could it possibly be? In their eyes, they think it's okay. But after that, guess what happened? They rioted. There was no National Guard. There was no state of emergency. There were no politicians that were going on CNN, MSNBC, or Fox or local stations saying, look at these thugs and these terrorists destroying property. They are destroying their community, and we have to put a stop to it. I bet you didn't even know it happened. A lot of people in here. I had to actually look it up because I knew that generally after a hockey game, and it happens every goddamn year after a hockey game, that the white people come out and they destroy some property, and the police know what's going to happen. They never mobilize police to prepare for it. There's not a phalanx of police holding back a bunch of drunken white people. It does not happen, even though these riots happen every year after the Stanley Cup Finals. They happen after college football games at Ohio State, the major universities that have very popular sports teams, and everyone knows it's going to happen, and it's allowed to happen. And they're just people expressing themselves and getting rowdy and happy, and it's much different than what we were called in Baltimore or Ferguson and anywhere where we rebel because of the conditions of oppression and repression. We're all aware of that. It's not a surprise. I just didn't know if people actually watched the news and saw that it happened again this year. As we would expect, I have given and I've written several articles on mental illness. And I'm generally driven to do that because of myself having been institutionalized and in hospitals and mental institutions for substance abuse and for mental illness, and having been exposed to a lot of things, and also politically, and understanding that many of the substance abuse, people who suffer from substance abuse and mental illness, these things, are a byproduct of the society of which we live in. But these kinds of things, mental illness, as an explanation, number one, it's not an explanation. Most people who suffer from, be it psychosis or another anti-social personality disorder, are not inclined to commit anything such as this. And even when it does happen, that is not an explanation for the events. But you have to analyze society itself, which is where these things come from. But they've been talking about it in this particular case. When have you heard it used when you talk about, oppressed people and the psychic trauma that you deal with? Imagine living somewhere and you go out in the world and you see all the devices and wealth that people have, and you go home and you don't even have electricity in your house. In the U.S., the richest country in the world. where you're lucky if you get one meal a day, and where every day is a struggle to survive. Imagine feeling powerless and hopeless. You have no access to wealth, access to education, access to a job, and you feel terrorized in your own community by the police. Whenever someone who lives under these circumstances commits or is alleged to commit a crime, very rarely does the state or anyone else talk about the psychic trauma that people have to live with and endure day to day. But in these particular cases, we hear it all the time, whether it's true or not, because in some instances, people do suffer from some illness, but that is not the reason for which the thing that they've done, even in the case of James Holmes, it's not the reason why they did it. But that's not the case in this particular instance. There's no professional that can talk about this person having been diagnosed with anything. All they say is that he was a transient high school student, which I have to, my partner Julie Fry, who's an attorney, look at that, and she said, most of my clients don't have a regular life. They're not going to schools where they have access to all the resources that they would need, and they would be described as transient, but when they go before a judge, they're not looked at that way. The book is thrown at them. In many cases, they're given what we call football numbers. 7 to 14 years, heavy sentences, and no one is trying to help them out of their circumstances. It is important for us, because of all of that, because everything that everyone is saying, all the excuses that are making, all the false explanations, for us as political people, as revolutionary people, as Marxists, to cut through all of the confusion and to give political clarity. One of the other things they bring up that they do time and time again is that if it was not for guns, this would not have happened. The most violent entity on the face of the earth, on the planet Earth, it's the imperialist state. The most violent entity known to man. Nazi Germany has nothing on the U.S. This is a country that has used a nuclear weapon to bomb another country twice. They use nuclear-coated weapons and drop bombs, and cancer is spread in the wind. That's why you have a country like Iraq, where cancer rates have increased by 1,000 times to which they were before. It's a country that supports the subjugation and mass murder of people all over the world, and it is a country that was born in blood. The foundation of capital itself, the primitive accumulation, was a bloody period of genocide, rape, mass murder, and enslavement of peoples. That's how they got the initial wealth from which the capitalist system arose. So it does not matter whether you have guns, people in the population have guns or not. Not very many people in Great Britain have guns, but Great Britain is as violent as the U.S. as a junior partner and has a long history of violence against oppressed people around the world. But we should answer that. We have to talk about the gun debate. And we have to talk about who stockpiles these weapons and the champions of the Second Amendment, the NRA. We have to talk about the fact that some of these people that champion a right to guns were singing a much different tune in the 60s when the Black Liberation Movement was arming itself. The first gun laws passed in the state were passed in California under Ronald Reagan, and it was in response to the Black Panther Party. The first federal gun laws were passed a year after that. To them, it is about who is armed. And for us, it should be about who is armed as well. We should demand and fight that all fascists, neo-Nazis be disarmed. And if the state ain't gonna do it, then we must organize ourselves to do it. Just as we must fight for the right for oppressed nations to arm themselves, why would we need to arm ourselves? Did you see McKinley, Texas?
Yeah.
I went to high school in Texas, in Dallas. So I know how Texas, I mean, you don't have to live, Teresa's from Texas. You can talk about it all day long. But did you see that video? Did you see the video in Fairfield, Ohio at another pool? I want to talk about Fairfield first because it was wild. If you listen to the 911 call, the white woman at the desk is making this 911 call, and she's crying, and she says they're beating up the cops. Then you watch the video. And the people that are getting beat up, it's the black family, not the cops. They're trying to pull their mother away from the police. And the young woman had her ribs broken and her jaw broken by the police. But you see, an event can have different perspectives. And it depends on your orientation. So you had this white woman who sees this event and she's thinking, look at these criminal black people and look at this cop. And if you just hear the 911 call, if you're not a political person, you don't know how these things work, you might think that there was chaos, but just watch the video. Look at Fairfield, Ohio public pool video and see it for yourself. And look at McKinley. And look at the way this cop pulls his gun on these young people. And the fact that this fight was started by some racist people who, because the people who called for the party were black, thought they shouldn't be there and they had no right to be there, even though the organizer of the party lived in that community and they had a right to that pool. And many of the black people and some of the white people actually did not live in the community. The person who shot the video said, I didn't live in the community, but the police were running past me like I was invisible. The killings, this particular instance of this young man, they took his life away. They destroyed his soul, and the state is responsible for killing him. Eric Garner, Tamir Rice. So you talk about gun control, but you can't even hold a toy gun if you're black. John Crawford in Walmart with a toy gun in Walmart, shot without any opportunity to explain himself. 12-year-old Tamir Rice. The cop don't step out of the car and shoots that young boy. In an open carry state. And this is a society where a white man can carry a gun in Hartsfield, Atlanta airport in full view of everyone, terrorizing people who are calling the police and saying we are scared, and the police have a conversation with him and allow him to continue about his way. And they say, oh, he has a right, but if I was carrying that gun, I guarantee you it would have been much different. We know that. The history of the destruction of the black liberation movement, the murders of black civil rights figures, the massacre in Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. The fact that the state came and disarmed the black people within that area and allowed the white militias and racist everyday whites to come in there and massacre people. Rosewood, Wilmington, North Carolina, the only coup in this country where people in that city were massacred and white business people took over leadership of that city. Sand Creek. We can go on and on. So why would we need to arm ourselves? Have we seen in this society that would lead us to think that we are not safe to arm ourselves? History itself. And why would the right wing and extreme right want to arm themselves to maintain the status quo? But going back to the issue of guns itself, the history of gun control in this country is related to controlling oppressed people. The black codes, which are enacted in the South to deny black people from legally owning firearms. In the North, before the end of slavery, free people weren't allowed to purchase firearms and white people weren't allowed to sell them to free blacks or to indigenous people. It's always been to control oppressed people. As we, continue forward and we talk about this, and it's, this is I started out the way that I did because I needed a second, and perhaps we should have all taken a moment of silence for those that were killed. It is hard to swallow. It is hard to deal with. It is hard to close your eyes at night because we know that this is not an isolated incident. This is not simply just a case of some racist white person who decided they want to kill a bunch of black people. Charleston is like the perfect example of racism in this society. I watched Mark Sanford, who was the former governor, who passed those racist anti-immigrant laws, which were the most strict at the time in the country, who also refused to support the maintenance of underground railroad sites in South Carolina. I sit and watched him squirm when Chris Hayes asked him, well, shouldn't we start talking about the Confederate flag that flies on state capitol grounds? And he said, we can't have that conversation. Many South Carolina, it's about, you understand, it's about history and it's about culture. Well, whose history and whose culture is it about? He said this on Calhoun Street, named after John C. Calhoun, slave owner and an ideologue of the Southern separation from the Northern states. He's one of the most ardent supporters of secession on the grounds of maintaining the right to have slaves, and he was an ardent white supremacist who felt that black people were right to be slaves because they were not as smart, and white people, it was their duty to own the slaves because of their very whiteness, their natural proclivity to be intelligent and industrious when your whole society was built on the labor of other people. So he's talking about culture and history. A city where the tourism industry is based on slavery and racism. Taking people to see plantations, taking people to the Citadel, which was an arsenal that was built after the rebellion actually wasn't even started, but the rebellion that was planned by Denmark Vesey, who was one of the co-founders of Mother Emanuel AME Church. That Citadel, which is now a military school, was built in response to that. So the whole culture and history is a culture of white supremacy and racism. And they wonder how a person like Dylan Roth could commit the act that he commit, how he could have the beliefs that he had in a racist U.S. and South Carolina. But just as you have these conditions that exist, you also have the reverse, which is the struggle itself. And that particular church, see, he knew what he was doing. He went to that church. And as we consider the massacre, we also have to consider the political assassination of Reverend Pinckney. That is not talked about. He asked for him by name. And this kind-hearted man had him sit next to me. And this is how you understand a person is so pathologically racist that they can sit in a room with people for an hour and turn around and massacre them. He knew where he was. He knew that this was a symbol of rebellion, a symbol of our political struggle, and he wanted to show black people that you should be afraid. He wanted to make people fear for their lives, and he was enacting a type of violence that we see every day in the rhetoric of right-wing and extreme right-wing. And though you have all of these politicians tripping over themselves to give their condolences, they're not tying it to systemic racism or to white supremacy. We can't divorce this from mass incarceration or police brutality. We can't divorce this from mass unemployment in the black community and poverty. We can't divorce this from the entire history of subjugation of oppressed people. And we can't divorce it from the brutal and repressive wars that are waged abroad against other darker peoples of the world. It is all tied into maintaining this racist, white supremacist, imperialist capitalist system. It took me a while to I sort of wrote this when C was taking her nap and pouring over my mind. And there's so many angles from which that we can discuss this. And I don't want to take up too much time. Actually, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, to people who know me, I have about 3 or 4 more pages. But I'm not going to drag us all through that. I think we understand where this comes from. But the thing that we have to be clear about is as we go forward, as we send our condolences to the people who lost their beloved, and to the community of South Carolina, and to the oppressed Black nation. But we also have to begin to politically give clarity to this particular instance, because it's not the only one of its kind in history. There have been many massacres. We can sit here and talk about them. We can sit here and talk about the superstructure and media as part of that, and the political superstructure and the laws that have been created, and how there's this image of Black people as this pariah in society, as hypersexual and hyper-violent and overly aggressive, and we are treated as if we are subhuman, and that all these ordinances that are on the books, be it, stop and frisk, be it broken windows policing, are directed at us and other oppressed people. And it is part of this whole system. But that in order for us to win justice, we must continue to amplify the struggle itself. We must continue to cut through the political morass and give clarity and show that this is not an isolated event, that the system is guilty. One particular person who was a racist white supremacist, but the entire system itself is guilty, and that the only way that we can ultimately win justice for the people that were massacred is to fight to disarm these people, to fight to disarm the state, and to fight to overturn the imperialist capitalist state. Because as long as it exists on this planet, there will continue to be massacres of Black people, of indigenous people, of Latino people, and this country will continue to pursue a policy of oppression and repression, be it here on internal nations or externally in oppressed nations, because that is how capitalism thrives, that is how it survives, off of this brutal repression and oppression, and it can't exist except but to have it. And if we are to exist, if we are to declare our humanity and our right to exist as human beings on this planet, and our right to partake in the wealth that we create, then we must overturn it. And we must put the real criminals on trial. Thank you.